I've spent years in hospital radiology, dark rooms, glowing screens, endless stacks of films. You'd think I'd be numb to it all by now. But there's one night I'll never forget. One night in the film archive that still makes me question what lingers in those boxes, what imprints don't fade even after the patient is long gone. It was a slow overnight shift. Most of the scans had been logged, the PACS system was quiet, and the hospital halls had that hollow silence you only hear after midnight. My colleague and I were assigned to reorganize the old film archive, a storage room in the basement that felt more like a crypt than a workplace. Floor-to-ceiling shelves, boxes stacked so high the air smelled of dust and vinegar, that sharp tang of aging film. We had both joked about how creepy it was. "If any place is haunted in this hospital, it's here," my colleague whispered, brushing cobwebs off a box. I laughed, but I kept glancing over my shoulder. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed faintly, throwing uneven shadows against the metal shelves. We had just settled into the rhythm of pulling boxes and cataloging when I froze. There was a sound. Not the building settling, not the hum of the HVAC. This was different. A distinct rustling like fingers flipping quickly through film after film. I looked at my colleague. She heard it too. We stood still, the silence around us thick. Then it came again, papers shifting, a box lid sliding, like someone searching with urgency. "Hello?" she called out, though her voice was shaky. No response. We followed the sound deeper into the rows, moving slow. The further we went, the stronger the smell of old film grew, like it had just been disturbed. And then we saw it. A box sat open on the floor, lid tossed aside. One X-ray had been pulled halfway out, the stiff film bent at an angle, as though someone had frozen mid-motion. My stomach dropped when I saw the patient name written across the corner. It wasn't just any patient. It was a case that had haunted this hospital for years. The name was Caldwell, a man who had come into the ER years back after a brutal accident. Multiple fractures, internal bleeding, crushed chest cavity. He shouldn't have survived as long as he did. The staff said he suffered terribly in his final hours. There were whispers about mistakes, about the trauma team's decisions that night. Some claimed his family had never forgiven us. Some said the case haunted not just the staff, but the building itself. And here it was, his X-ray, sitting like it had been chosen, pulled out by invisible hands. I reached down, hesitant, and touched the film. It was ice cold, not the normal chill of basement storage colder. My fingers actually tingled as though frost had kissed them. I slipped the film out fully and held it up toward the buzzing light. His chest cavity stared back at me. Bones fractured like glass, ribs bent inward like claws. But that wasn't what made my throat go dry. Across the surface of the film, faint but unmistakable, were streaks, lines that looked like handprints. Not printed by ink, but etched somehow into the emulsion itself. One hand over his ribs, another at his throat. Too clear, too deliberate to be scratches or age. My colleague whispered, "That's not possible." Her voice trembled like a child's. We both stared, frozen, when the rustling sound started again. Not behind us this time, around us. From the shelves, from the boxes stacked high. Films shifting, sliding in their sleeves, hundreds of them moving just slightly out of place, like restless bodies turning in unison. We backed toward the door, and that's when the light above flickered once, then buzzed back steady. For a split second, in that flicker, I swear I saw someone in the aisle. A figure, shoulders hunched, head tilted unnaturally, watching us from the far end of the row. When the light steadied, the aisle was empty. We dropped the film back in the box and shoved the lid closed. Neither of us said a word as we walked out, our footsteps loud against the concrete floor. Back upstairs? I tried to convince myself it was just fatigue, just nerves. But the cold in my fingers lingered long after. And the next morning, When another tech went down to finish the cataloging, she swore she found that same film sitting on the table again, pulled halfway out, as if waiting to be found. To this day, no matter how many times they try to file it away, it ends up back on top. That one film, that one name, the case that refuses to rest. And sometimes, when I'm down in that archive alone, I swear I still hear it, the faint, steady sound of someone flipping through films, looking for something they'll never stop searching for. I've worked in radiology for years. I've seen patients come in terrified of what the scans might reveal, scared of the machines, scared of the silence. But nothing unsettles them more than the lead room. If you've never seen one, it's a small sealed chamber where we place patients during nuclear medicine scans. The walls are lined with thick lead to contain radiation. No windows, no comfort, just a chair, a table, sometimes a small monitor, and that oppressive quiet. Patients sit in there alone for minutes, sometimes hours, while radioactive tracers move through their bodies. We watch them on cameras, communicate through intercoms, but once that door shuts, it feels like another world. And one night, I found out just how otherworldly it could be. It was a late shift, quiet in the department. The halls carried that low hum you only hear after midnight, the buzz of fluorescent lights, the distant whir of machines cooling down. I had a patient scheduled for a thyroid uptake scan. She was in her late 40s, calm but visibly nervous, twisting her hands as I explained the process. "You'll sit in the lead room for about 20 minutes, I told her. "You'll be alone, but I'll be watching the whole time. If you need me, just press the call button." She nodded, forcing a smile. But her eyes darted toward the heavy gray door like she already hated the thought of it closing behind her. I led her in, sat her down in the chair, explained again how we'd monitor her. She looked around nervously. "It feels like a vault," she whispered. I smiled, trying to lighten the mood. "That's because it is, basically. You'll be fine." I shut the door, the heavy seal echoing like a lock on a tomb. Then I went back to the console to monitor her. For the first 10 minutes, everything was routine. She shifted in her chair, adjusted her sweater, looked down at her hands. Then it changed. Suddenly, she sat upright, eyes wide, staring at the far corner of the room. Her lips moved at first silently, then audibly. I flicked on the intercom. "You doing okay in there?" She shook her head, her voice trembling. "There's someone in here with me." I frowned, checked the monitor. The camera showed only her. The corners were empty. No movement, nothing. "There's no one in there, I promise," I said, keeping my voice steady. But she pressed back into the chair, shaking her head violently. "No, you don't understand. He's in the corner, sitting there, watching me." The hair on my arms prickled. I checked the feed again, nothing, just an empty chair in the corner. I looked at my colleague, who had stopped typing reports and was staring at the screen too. "Should we go in?" she whispered. Before I could answer, the patient screamed. Not loud, but sharp, panicked, like someone had just leaned too close to her ear. "He moved!" she cried. I grabbed the key, hurried to the door, and swung it open. The room was silent. Empty. The air inside felt heavy, thick, like stepping into a basement that hadn't been opened in years. My eyes went straight to the corner. The chair was moving, rocking gently back and forth, but no one was sitting in it. The patient bolted past me into the hall, clutching her chest, sobbing. I stepped inside fully, my heart hammering. The rocking slowed, then stopped, as if whoever had been there had just stood up and walked away. My colleague appeared behind me. "What the hell?" she whispered. We both just stared at the chair. There was no draft, no vent, no explanation. That room is airtight when the door is shut. We escorted the patient back upstairs. tried to calm her. She refused to finish the scan. She kept repeating, "He was there. He was there. He sat with me." For weeks afterward, I avoided being the one to prep patients in that room. Every time I shut the door, I half expected to hear movement when I checked the cameras. And though no one else ever reported seeing him, a few patients swore they felt watched in there, that the silence felt occupied. To this day, I can't explain it. The camera never showed a thing. The records never hinted at anything unusual. But I'll never forget that chair. That slow, deliberate rocking. And sometimes, when I'm down there alone, grabbing supplies, I swear I hear it again, just faintly. The creak of wood shifting, the rhythm of a chair moving back and forth like someone, unseen, is waiting for company. I've been in radiology for a long time, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's that the machines don't lie. They pick up what's there, what the eye can't see, what the hands can't touch. Fluoroscopy especially, it's unforgiving, exposing every detail in real time. But one night in the operating room, it showed us something that no one could explain. Something I still think about every time I step into surgery. It was a spinal procedure, nothing unusual. I was assisting with the C-arm, the big, mobile fluoroscopy unit we wheel into the OR when the surgeons need live imaging. It gives them a moving X-ray, helps guide instruments, screws, and plates. The kind of thing we use daily. I'd set it up 100 times before. The patient was prepped, draped, and under anesthesia. Everything was sterile, calm, controlled. The surgeon was confident, chatting lightly as he positioned his tools. I moved the C-arm into place, lined it up, and hit the pedal. The monitor lit up with the familiar glow of bone and shadow. That's when he stopped talking. "Hold on," he muttered, leaning closer to the screen. He pointed with his gloved hand. "Why am I seeing two spines?" I froze, eyes darting to the monitor. At first, I thought it was a double exposure or some overlap from the machine. But no, clear as day, there were two sets of vertebrae on the screen. One exactly where it should be, perfectly matching the patient on the table, and another, faint, just off to the side, like a shadow mimicking it. But it wasn't a simple artifact. This second spine wasn't aligned. The bones were distorted, twisted, uneven like they'd healed wrong after terrible trauma. "There's only one patient here, right?" the surgeon said, half joking, half serious. The anesthesiologist gave him a look. "Of course. What are you talking about?" I tried to explain. "Sometimes you get ghosting, overlapping images if the machine—" "No," the surgeon cut me off. He was shaking his head, eyes locked on the monitor. "That's not an artifact. That's anatomy. Look at the detail in those discs." And he was right. It was too sharp to be a glitch. The curvature, the spacing, the fractures, it looked like it had belonged to someone real. I repositioned the C-arm, thinking maybe the angle would clear it. I swung it left, then right, adjusting as carefully as I could. Each time, the patient's spine stayed crisp in the middle of the screen, and each time, the second one stayed too, faint but constant, shadowing us like it refused to be erased. At one point, the surgeon asked me to freeze the image. He studied it, silent, the room tense. "It's like another body's lying under him," he said, finally, voice low. The words sank into the sterile air. Nobody laughed. Nobody brushed it off. We all just stared at that extra spine, pale on the screen. Then something happened that I'll never forget. The faint spine moved, just slightly, as if it shifted when the patient didn't. A subtle tilt, a vertebra angling differently, independent of the body on the table. The surgeon cursed under his breath. "That's enough," he said. He ordered me to reposition again, and finally, after a long adjustment, The second spine flickered and vanished. The screen showed only the patient, clean and clear, as if nothing had ever been wrong. The surgery continued, but the air in that OR was heavy. Everyone worked quieter than usual, eyes flicking to the monitor more than they needed to. We finished without incident, and the patient woke up with no complications. He never knew what we saw hovering over him. Later, when I shut down the C-arm and rolled it back to storage, I caught my reflection in its metal surface. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone else should have been reflected there too, someone we'd glimpsed only briefly, caught in the X-ray's unforgiving light. I tell myself it was just interference, a fluke, an unrepeatable glitch. But every time I'm in the OR and that monitor flickers to life, part of me wonders, if bones can hold on long after the flesh is gone, maybe some echoes of the body remain too, and maybe, just maybe, sometimes the machines pick them up. Because once, in that operating room, a patient came in with one spine, and for a moment, we saw two. I've seen a lot of strange things in radiology. When you work around CTs, MRIs, and fluoroscopy long enough, you get used to artifacts, lines that shouldn't be there, distortions caused by movement, by metal, by technical glitches. We shrug them off, fix them, and move on. But one night, a CT scan came across my screen that I still can't shake. Something I can't explain, no matter how many times I replay it in my head. It was a routine CT head. The patient was a middle-aged man, nothing extraordinary. He'd come in with headaches and dizziness, symptoms we see every single day. He wasn't in acute distress, wasn't crashing, just someone looking for answers. We got him onto the table, positioned his head, reminded him to stay still. The scan began, the machine's rhythmic hum filling the control room. The slices started populating on the monitor cross-sections of the brain, clean, detailed, layer by layer. Everything looked normal at first. No bleeds, no masses, nothing unusual. I was halfway through reviewing the dataset when one image stopped me cold. It was just one slice, just one, but in it, something was pressed against the outside of the patient's skull. A face. Not bone, not artifact, not anatomy. A face. It wasn't his, either. This was different, longer, thinner, distorted. The features were warped but recognizable. Deep-set eyes, a suggestion of a mouth pressed open as if screaming. Cheeks distorted like they were flattened against glass. The face looked like it was trying to push through the scan itself, as though it were trapped between layers of bone and air. My first thought was artifact, some fluke. I toggled through the neighboring slices. Before it, nothing. After it, normal again. But right there, in that single frame, the face lingered. Clear, unequivocal. I felt my chest tighten. I showed it to my colleague, who went pale as soon as the monitor lit up. That's not possible," she whispered. We called the radiologist. He leaned in, adjusting his glasses, scrolling back and forth through the slices. For a long time, he didn't say a word. Finally, he sat back, shaking his head. "Artifact," he muttered at first, almost convincing himself. Then, softer, he added, "Unexplainable." He signed off the report as normal. Nothing noted. But he couldn't take his eyes off that one image. None of us could. The patient left that night unaware. We didn't tell him. We couldn't. How do you explain something like that to a man who just came in with headaches? We sent him on his way, told him to follow up with his doctor, like it was just another case. But the next morning, I heard he never made it to his follow-up. He died in his sleep, peacefully, they said. No obvious cause, just gone. When I heard, my stomach dropped. I couldn't stop thinking about that face. Pressed so close, so desperate, like it had been waiting for him. like it had already claimed him before he left the hospital. I've looked at thousands of DICOM images since then. Thousands of heads, thousands of brains. Every time I scroll through, I half expect to see it again, that same distorted face, peering out from the black and white. But I never have. Still, sometimes when I'm in the control room late at night, staring at the glow of the monitors, I get the feeling I'm being watched. Not by the patients in the machine, by something outside of it. By something waiting for the scan to catch it again. And when I think of that man, gone less than a day after we saw what we saw, I can't help but wonder if the machine didn't just capture anatomy that night. Maybe it captured something else. Something we were never meant to see. Because for one single slice, one fraction of a second, the CT showed us more than bone and tissue. It showed us a face pressed against the edge of reality, and the man beneath it never woke up again. I've walked the halls of the hospital more nights than I can count, but there's one stretch I never cross without a chill crawling up my spine. It's the corridor that leads to interventional radiology. A long, sterile hallway that feels colder than the rest of the building no matter what time of year it is. If you're on the night shift, you know what I'm talking about. Around 3 in the morning, when the whole hospital is quiet and even the ICU feels like it's holding its breath, that hallway changes. The lights there don't just dim, they flicker, stutter, as if the electricity itself is afraid to hold steady. I used to laugh it off. Old wiring, I told myself. Hospitals are full of that. Machines that hum, bulbs that buzz. But then I started noticing the stories weren't just rumors, they were patterns. I remember the first time it happened to me. I was pushing a supply cart down that corridor, bone-tired and half-running on caffeine. The wheels squeaked on the linoleum, the sound echoing in a way that made the hall feel endless. Right on schedule, the fluorescent lights above me sputtered. Not all of them, just the middle section, always the same row, always at the same hour. I slowed down, glanced at the walls, told myself not to be jumpy. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught movement. A figure, someone in scrubs stepping into one of the doorways on my left. Just a quick glimpse, like a coworker ducking into a room. Relieved, I actually called out, "Hey, you working late too?" No answer. I pushed the cart forward, stopped at the doorway, and looked in. The room was empty. No one at the desk, no one behind the curtains, no one at all. I backed out, heartbeat thudding in my ears, and glanced down the hall. That's when I realized I wasn't the first to see it. One of the anesthesiologists told me he'd been walking the same hallway after prepping a patient when he saw a man in scrubs step into the imaging suite. He followed him in, thinking it was another nurse. But the room was dark. No machines on, no lights, no person. Just silence. A tech once swore she saw a woman with her hair tucked under a cap standing halfway down the corridor, motionless, like she was waiting. When she blinked, the woman was gone. We've tried to rationalize it. Maybe we're overtired. Maybe the flickering lights are playing tricks on our eyes. Maybe. But the details stick. Always scrubs. Always that same section of hallway. Always vanishing into a doorway that leads nowhere. The strangest part is the records. Years back, that corridor wasn't just a passage to interventional radiology. It used to connect to the old OR wingback when surgeries ran late into the night and staffing was thinner. There was an accident there once, decades ago. A fire from faulty wiring in one of the procedure rooms. Staff tried to evacuate everyone, but not everyone made it out. They said one nurse didn't make it. Trapped inside when the smoke filled the corridor. Her name barely shows up in the files now, just a brief mention. But sometimes, when the lights flicker, I wonder if she's still there, caught in that endless loop, walking the hallway, stepping into rooms that no longer exist. Now, whenever I work nights, I avoid that corridor if I can. If I can't, I move fast, eyes forward, refusing to glance at the doorways. Because the one time I did, I'll never forget what I saw. Not just a figure, not just a shape in scrubs, a face turned toward me, pale in the flickering light, staring, watching, and then gone. I kept walking, but the feeling stayed with me all night, the sense that someone had stepped just out of sight, still standing there in the dark, waiting for the next person to pass by. To this day, whenever 3 a.m. rolls around, I know somewhere in that corridor, the lights are stuttering, and someone who isn't supposed to be there is stepping silently into a doorway that leads nowhere. I started in radiology back when we still shot everything on film. Digital was creeping in, but in our department, the old ways held on a little longer. If you've never worked with it, you can't imagine the atmosphere of a hospital darkroom at night. It was a world apart from the bright, sterile spaces of imaging suites. You walked through a heavy door into near total darkness, just a faint red glow from the safe light, the smell of fixer and developer hanging in the air. You'd feed the films through the processor, hang them up to dry, and wait for the images to emerge like ghosts out of nothing. That night I was alone in the darkroom. It was well past midnight, the time when everything in the hospital feels like it's holding its breath. The only sound was the quiet trickle of chemicals moving through the machine and the occasional soft click of a film drying on the rack. I'd developed dozens of chest films that evening, and the last batch was hanging in front of me, black and glossy, the images slowly taking shape. Then I heard it. 3 sharp knocks on the door. I froze. Everyone knew you didn't knock on the darkroom door. If you had to enter, you called out first so you didn't ruin the films with stray light. The knocks were firm, deliberate, spaced just far enough apart to sound like someone with purpose, not a random tap. "Yeah?" I called out, my voice sounding small in the red-lit room. No answer. I wiped my hands on my lab coat, crossed the room, and opened the door. The hallway outside was empty. It's hard to explain how strange the hospital feels at that hour. Corridors that are bustling by day look endless and vacant by night. The polished floors reflect the ceiling lights in long, distorted streaks, and every sound carries forever. But right then, there was nothing. No footsteps, no voices, not even the hum of a nearby machine. Just silence. I leaned out, looked both ways, even stepped into the hall. Nothing. I closed the door, heart thudding a little harder than it should have been. Back inside, the safe light felt dimmer than before. The smell of the chemicals seemed sharper. The films on the rack hung in front of me like a curtain. That's when I noticed something wrong. Every film in that batch had a mark on it that shouldn't have been there. Not a streak, not a scratch, not an artifact from the processor. On each film, clear as day, were blurry outlines of hands. Dozens of them. Some small, some large. Fingers splayed, palms pressed flat, as if someone had leaned against the film from the other side. I stepped closer, my breath fogging in the cool air. The outlines weren't random. They were pressed at different angles, some overlapping, some clawing. They looked like hands trying to get out. I ran my fingers along the surface of one film. It felt normal, smooth and dry, but the images were there, embedded. I flipped through them one by one, every single chest film in that batch marked. The patient's ribs and lungs were faint behind the shapes, almost swallowed by them. I backed up, staring at the door. My mind raced through explanations. Contamination? A defect in the chemical bath? Static electricity? But none of those would create something so deliberate, so human. The more I looked, the more it felt like the hands were pressing from the inside of the film toward me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The darkroom suddenly felt smaller, tighter, as if someone else was in there with me. I could almost hear the soft slap of wet palms against glass. like the echoes of whatever had left those prints. I pulled the films down and stuffed them into a folder, my hands trembling. I didn't develop another role that night. I couldn't. Later, when I showed them to the radiologist, he went pale. He tried to laugh it off. Probably some processing defect, but he didn't meet my eyes. We never figured out what caused it. Those films were quietly pulled from the archive and misplaced. I never saw them again. But sometimes, when I'm alone in a dim room and I hear a soft knock on the door, I'm back there, back in that red glow, the smell of fixer in the air, the quiet drip of chemicals. And I remember the hands, dozens of them, pressed into the only evidence that night left behind. And I never, ever opened the door right away anymore. I've been working in radiology long enough to know that no system is perfect. Even our PACS, the picture, archiving, and communication system we rely on every day, glitches once in a while. Sometimes it's just lag. Sometimes an image fails to load. Sometimes an artifact pops up that we can shrug off as nothing more than corrupted data. But one night, I saw something on PACS that I'll never forget. Something that couldn't be explained away as a glitch. Something that still follows me when I log into the system at 3 in the morning. It started like any other overnight shift. The ER had been busy with chest pain cases, shortness of breath, the usual line of patients who needed urgent chest x-rays. I'd gotten into that rhythm of moving people in and out of the room, setting them up against the detector, telling them, take a deep breath and hold it. Routine, mechanical, comforting in its familiarity. I uploaded the images into PACS and began reviewing. Most of them looked the way you'd expect, clear lungs, a few infiltrates here and there, some enlarged hearts, the typical shadows you see in an ER crowd. I was halfway through the batch when one image made me freeze. At first glance, it was a normal chest film. The patient's ribs were there, the diaphragm, the lung fields. But as I leaned closer, my stomach twisted. Inside the right lung field, just above the heart, was a face. Not a vague shadow, not an impression you could argue away. A face. It was grinning. The contours were wrong for anatomy. The eyes were too deep, the nose too sharp, the mouth stretched into a smile that didn't belong to anyone in that room. The grin looked deliberate, mocking, as if whoever or whatever it was had been waiting for me to see it. I blinked, leaned back, then forward again, telling myself it had to be artifact. Maybe the detector picked up some interference. Maybe PACS stitched something wrong. I toggled the contrast, adjusted the windowing. The grin didn't fade. It sharpened. The teeth stood out against the black of the lung like they were lit from within. My colleague was across the room, finishing up paperwork. "Come here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She walked over, took one look, and went pale. That's not possible." We both knew the patient. Middle-aged, short of breath, anxious but stable. He was supposed to be admitted for observation. Nothing about him screamed immediate danger. Yet there it was, this grotesque grin carved into the shadows of his lungs. We called the radiologist. He stared at the screen for a long time without speaking, his hand frozen on the mouse. Finally, he muttered, "I don't know what this is, but it's not anatomy." He hesitated, then added under his breath, "It's unexplainable." We didn't report it in the findings. How could we? What do you write? Abnormal facial anomaly in lung field? We closed the case, sent the images to the archive, and tried to convince ourselves it was just PACS glitching again. But later that night, the call came from the floor. The patient had gone into sudden cardiac arrest. They couldn't bring him back. 1 minute he was talking, the next he was gone. When I heard, a chill spread through me. I couldn't stop thinking about that grin, sitting there in his chest like it had been waiting for him. Like it knew before any of us did that he wouldn't live until morning. Since then, I've seen other PACS anomalies, lines, double exposures, data corruption. But every time, I think back to that face. Sometimes, when I'm reviewing images in the quiet hours of the night, the system will lag for half a second, and I'll hold my breath, waiting for another face to appear where it shouldn't. And I wonder, are these really glitches? Or are the machines picking up something we can't understand, something that walks with our patients as they come through our doors, waiting in the dark until it's time to collect? Because once, on an ordinary night, I saw a grin inside a man's lungs, and by dawn, he was dead. I've worked in radiology long enough to know the hospital can play tricks on you. When you spend night after night in endless hallways, listening to the hum of machines and the shuffle of patients, your eyes start to catch things that aren't there. At least, that's what I used to tell myself. Until the night I met a man who couldn't have been there at all. It was one of those late shifts when everything feels stretched thin. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, the waiting area was quiet, and I was standing just outside the CT suite, checking the schedule. That's when I noticed him. A man in a faded hospital gown was walking slowly toward me, bare feet whispering against the tile. He looked tired, pale, but calm. His eyes met mine with a kind of quiet desperation. "Excuse me," he said softly. "Where do I check in for my scan?" I nodded toward the admitting desk at the end of the hall. "Just over there," I told him. "The clerk will help you." He gave me a grateful half smile and shuffled past me toward the desk. I turned back to my clipboard, made a note, and only a few seconds later glanced down the hall again. He was gone. The corridor was empty. The waiting area was empty. The clerk sat alone at her desk, tapping on her keyboard like no one had approached her at all. At first, I thought maybe he'd moved faster than I realized, stepped into a restroom or a nearby exam room. But I hadn't heard a door open. The hallway was silent except for the low drone of the ventilation system. I walked toward the desk anyway, my shoes squeaking softly against the floor. "Did a man just check in?" I asked the clerk. She frowned. "What man?" I described him, the hospital gown, the pale skin, the way he'd looked right at me. Her expression changed slowly. She didn't look confused anymore. She looked unsettled. Without saying anything, she turned to her computer, scrolled through a few screens, then finally opened a drawer and pulled out a folder. Inside was a stack of papers with a photo clipped to the top. "Is this who you saw?" she asked. The picture showed the same man. Same face, same tired eyes, same faint smile. My stomach dropped. "That's him." She stared at me for a long moment before lowering her voice. "He died last week, right here in the hospital. He was waiting for a scan he never got." The room seemed to tilt. I tried to make sense of it, tried to tell myself she was mistaken, that I had misidentified someone else. But no, I knew the man I saw. His face was burned into my memory. He had spoken to me. He had asked me where to check in. And then he was gone. I walked the halls for the rest of my shift, half expecting him to step out again, to finish the journey he hadn't been able to make. But the corridors stayed empty, and the air felt heavier than usual, as if the walls themselves were holding on to his presence. For days afterward, I couldn't shake it. Every time a patient in a gown shuffled toward me, I felt my chest tighten, waiting to see if they'd vanish too. I kept remembering the way he'd looked at me like he trusted me to guide him where he needed to go. And the awful truth was, I had pointed him in the direction of a place he could never reach. Sometimes I wonder if he was lost, not in the hospital, but somewhere else entirely. Maybe he kept searching for the scan that never came, for the appointment that death stole from him. Maybe, for just one moment, he found his way back into the hallway where he thought he still belonged. And sometimes, late at night, when the waiting area is quiet and the clerk is typing in the dim light of her desk lamp, I find myself looking up, expecting him to come walking toward me again. Bare feet against tile, tired eyes meeting mine, asking where to check in for a scan he'll never receive. Because once, in radiology, I spoke to a patient who had already died, and I think he's still waiting to be called back. I've been in radiology for years, and I can tell you this: the OR and fluoroscopy suites see more than broken bones and contrast dye. They hold stories. Strange, unsettling stories that no one writes in a chart. I never believed much in that kind of thing. Not really until the night the lead apron moved on its own, and a patient whispered words I'll never forget. It was a late procedure, fluoroscopy guided. The kind of case where timing matters, and the whole room is focused on every move. The patient was an older man, weak but alert, lying under the scope while the surgeon worked. I was there assisting, adjusting the C-arm and making sure the equipment stayed sterile and precise. I remember being tired. The air in those rooms is always heavy, warm under the surgical lights, and the smell of disinfectant never really leaves you. I had set a lead apron, a heavy, thick piece of protective gear, on the counter at the back of the room. We all do it sometimes, when you don't need it immediately. That apron had been lying flat, folded neatly, the way it always does. Minutes later, while my eyes were on the monitor, I heard it. The unmistakable scrape of something sliding across stainless steel. I turned, just in time to see the apron slip forward and drop off the counter. But it didn't just fall. It moved. It slid with purpose, like someone had pulled it toward them. The apron's weight is no joke. 20 pounds of lead doesn't just glide on its own. I stood frozen, the sound echoing too loud in the silent room. Everyone paused for a moment. Even the surgeon looked up. Before I could process it, the patient stirred. His lips trembled, and in a shaky whisper that cut right through the sterile air, he said, "She's here." I felt my chest tighten. "Who?" I asked gently, leaning closer. But his eyes weren't on me. They weren't on the surgeon. They were staring past us, toward the corner of the room. Seconds later, alarms erupted. His vitals plummeted. His body stiffened. He coded right there on the table. The crash team rushed in. Compressions began. Meds were pushed. The surgeon barked orders. The anesthesiologist worked the airway. The room was chaos, a storm of movement and noise. I backed against the counter, heart pounding, my eyes still fixed on that apron lying crumpled on the floor. We lost him. Despite everything, he never came back. The monitor flatlined, and the surgeon finally called it. Just like that, the room fell into that unnatural silence you only hear after a code fails, the sound of gloves snapping off, the click of instruments being set down, the sigh of defeat no one wants to voice. I bent down, picked up the apron with shaking hands, and folded it back onto the counter. It felt colder than it should have, as though it had been lying on ice. Later, when the room had been cleared and the body taken away, a colleague leaned against the wall and muttered, "That's not the first time something like that's happened." I stared at her, and she wouldn't meet my eyes. She just said, "Some patients, they know when someone's waiting for them." I've thought about that night more times than I can count. The weight of that apron sliding off as though tugged. The patient whispering those words, "She's here," with absolute certainty, as if he recognized the presence we couldn't see, and then his heart giving out as if on cue. I still work in fluoroscopy, and I still handle those lead aprons. But every time I set one down, I watch it out of the corner of my eye, because once I saw one move without a hand near it, and a patient under the scope swore someone had come for him. Now, when the room grows too still, when the air feels heavier than the lead I carry, I wonder if she's still there, waiting quietly in the corner, unseen, until the next patient whispers her arrival. Because that night proved something to me. In radiology, the images may reveal the body, but sometimes the room itself reveals the soul, leaving you with the memory of a whisper, and the sound of 20 pounds of lead hitting the floor. I've worked in radiology long enough to know that every hospital has its stories. Some are just rumors, hallway whispers to pass the night shift, but others have a way of repeating themselves, with too much detail, too much consistency, to brush aside. And there's one that still unsettles me, no matter how many times I try to rationalize it. It's about a chair. Just a single chair, nothing special. Beige vinyl cushion, metal frame, scuffed from years of use. It sits outside MRI room 2, tucked against the wall near the hallway junction. By all appearances, it's just another piece of hospital furniture. But anyone who works nights in radiology knows that chair is different. That chair is avoided. I first heard about it from one of the transporters. He swore he'd seen an old woman sitting there, clutching her handbag tight in her lap, her head bowed like she was praying. When he looked away and then back, the chair was empty. He laughed when he told it, but there was a flicker in his eyes like he wasn't joking. I didn't give it much thought until I saw her for myself. It was past 2 in the morning, the kind of shift where the silence of the halls makes every sound stand out, the hum of the MRI, the beep of distant monitors, the squeak of my own shoes. I rounded the corner toward room 2, carrying a chart, and that's when I saw her. She was sitting in the chair, an old woman, thin, her gray hair pulled back neatly. Her handbag was clutched so tightly to her chest, her knuckles were white. Her gaze wasn't on me, but straight ahead, fixed on the closed MRI door. I slowed down, my throat suddenly dry. "Ma'am?" I asked quietly. "Are you waiting for someone?" No response. I stepped closer, just a few feet away. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and for a split second, I thought I saw her shoulders tremble as if she had sighed. Then I blinked, and the chair was empty. The chart slipped in my hands, and I nearly dropped it. I wasn't imagining it. I know what I saw, but there was no one in the hallway. No door opening, no retreating footsteps. Just that empty chair against the wall. Later, I asked the clerk at the desk to pull up the hallway camera. I needed to prove to myself that my eyes had played a trick. We rewound the footage, and there I was walking down the hall, slowing, staring at the chair. The chair was empty the whole time. I stopped talking about it after that, but I started avoiding the hallway when I could, taking the longer route past the recovery room instead. I wish I could say that was the end of it, but the patients feel it too. I've wheeled more than one past that chair, and I've lost count of how many shivered and whispered the same thing. Cold hands. They'd flinch suddenly, like invisible fingers had brushed against theirs. One patient actually pulled his arm to his chest and muttered, "She grabbed me." What unsettles me most is the consistency. They all describe the same feeling. Thin, cold hands, lingering just long enough to send a shiver into their bones. Once, during a quiet shift, one of the younger nurses admitted she'd seen the old woman too. She described her down to the handbag, the neat hair, the silent way she sat staring at MRI room 2. She said she'd followed the figure with her eyes, terrified, until a coworker broke her focus and the woman was gone. Some say she was a patient, years ago, who collapsed while waiting for her scan. Others claim she was a wife who sat there every night until her husband passed, and she never really left. No one knows for sure. Her name isn't in any record I've found, but her presence lingers in that chair. Now, every time I walk past it, I keep my eyes straight ahead. Because if I let them drift, if I give in to curiosity, I know what I'll see. That handbag clutched tight, those tired eyes fixed on the MRI door, waiting for a scan that never came. And sometimes, when a patient squeezes my hand a little too hard and whispers, "She's here," I feel it too, that cold grip, delicate but unyielding, curling around my fingers just long enough to remind me. The chair outside MRI room 2 may look empty, But in this hospital, we know better. Empty doesn't always mean alone. I started in radiology back when we still worked with film. No packs, no glowing digital monitors, just rolls of X-ray film, trays of developer and fixer, and the faint red glow of the safe light. If you've never stood alone in a hospital darkroom after midnight, you don't know how different it feels from the rest of the building. The world outside fades. Time slows. The only sounds are the hiss of chemicals and the soft crackle of film curling as it dries. That night started like dozens of others. It was the graveyard shift, quiet. The corridors beyond the darkroom deserted. I'd been processing chest films for the ER one after another. Rinse, hang, move on. The darkroom was warm from the machines, heavy with the metallic tang of developer. I had my routine. Feed the film into the processor, wait for it to emerge, hang it on the racks to dry. Simple, mechanical. I had just hung a new set when I felt the change in the air. Not colder, exactly, but heavier, like someone had stepped into the room behind me. I didn't turn around at first. I told myself it was just fatigue. The hour, the isolation. I kept my eyes on the drying rack, on the pale outlines of bones starting to appear. Then, right over my shoulder, a voice whispered my name. Not loud, not harsh, just a soft, breathy sound so close to my ear I could feel it move the little hairs on my neck. I spun around so fast I nearly knocked over the chemical tray. The red glow revealed every inch of the room. Empty. No one at the door, no shadow slipping out. Just me and the hiss of the processor. My heart was hammering. "Hello?" I called out. My voice sounded strange in that small space, swallowed by the walls. No answer. I backed up toward the racks, trying to convince myself it had been a pipe hissing, a trick of the air vent, anything but what it felt like a human voice leaning in close. That's when I noticed the film I'd just hung. The images had developed enough now to be visible. It was a chest X-ray, a stark rib cage glowing faintly in the red light. Only the ribs weren't empty. Behind them, in the lung fields where black should have been, was the faintest shape, blurry but unmistakable, a face. Not a normal artifact, not a smudge or streak. The features were pressed outward, distorted, like someone trying to push through the patient's chest, like a reflection caught in the wrong place. I stared at it, my mouth dry, the smell of chemicals suddenly sharp and nauseating. The face seemed to stare back at me, though its eyes were little more than shadows. And then I heard it again. My name, this time from the far side of the room, whispered low. Like someone crouched behind the racks. I dropped the clip I was holding. It clattered onto the tile. I forced myself to move, to sweep the room with my eyes. No one. Nothing. The safe light flickered once, and for just a heartbeat, the ribs on the film seemed to shift, like something behind them was moving. I yanked the film down, shoved it into a bin, and killed the lights. The door handle felt cold under my fingers as I fled back into the bright hallway. When I showed the film to the radiologist the next morning, he frowned, squinted, and said, "Artifact." But he didn't look at me while he said it. He quietly filed it away and never spoke of it again. I still think about that night. The whisper, the breath against my ear, the face behind the ribs. We went digital soon after. No more darkroom, no more trays of chemicals hissing in the night. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the new imaging suite and the monitors glow in the dark, I swear I hear it again. My name, soft and close. And every time, I remember that rib cage glowing in the red light and the thing behind it staring back at me. Because in radiology, the pictures don't just capture bones. Sometimes, they capture what's waiting behind them. Hi. I just want to take a moment to thank every single one of you for being here. Your support means more than words can ever express. Every view, every like, every comment, it all helps keep this channel alive and growing. If you've enjoyed these stories, Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. It really makes a huge difference. I'd also love to hear from you. Share your own experiences in the comment section, and let me know where you're watching from. Hearing your stories and seeing the places you all come from is one of the best parts of this community. Thank you again for being part of this journey with me.